Good afternoon, Minister. My name is Alan Honner. I'm a lawyer at the Democracy Fund, and we share status with the JCSF and Citizens for Freedom. Ms. Freeland, in your witness statement, you mentioned challenges to supply chains as being a major focus for you in January of 2022. But you didn't mention the government vaccine mandate for truckers, and I'd just like to ask you a little bit about that. Can we please pull up OTT 3027621.0001. And Ms. Freeland, while we're waiting for that to come up, this is a letter which is addressed to you and other ministers by the Canadian Trucking Alliance, and it's dated December 10th, 2021. I'd like to take you through part of this letter, but before I do that, can you tell me, do you know who this group is, the Canadian Trucker Alliance?
I can't say I'm familiar with them right now. Maybe I've heard of them, but...
Okay, well, I think we've heard some evidence about them, but if you're not familiar with them, that's okay. Let's just go down to the first paragraph here. And Ms. Freeland, I just want to read this to you. It says that the Canadian Trucker Alliance is disappointed to learn that our current exemption from the national vaccination mandate is being removed, considering the immense impact this decision will have on already beleaguered supply chains. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay, and if I can take you to another part of that letter, just on the second page, second paragraph, please. Here we see CTA estimates that combined, the proposed vaccine mandate for cross-border truck drivers and the federal sector mandate announced by the Minister of Labour would remove between 15,000 and 30,000 Canadian drivers from the interprovincial and international supply chains. The expected loss of transportation service capacity will trigger significant ripple effects throughout the entire economy. And Ms. Freeland, I just want to ask you, this is something you knew about when the exemption for truckers was removed in February. You knew that this might have some effect on the supply chain. Is that fair?
I knew that some people asserted that it might.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to suggest, this is not the first time this group wrote to you. If we can scroll down to page 5, please. We have another letter, just to the top of page 5. It might be page 4. Just go up, please. Okay, so here we have a letter. It is a little bit down, please. I'm sorry. Can we just go to the top? So December the 8th, 2021. And if we can scroll down to the second paragraph, it says here, when the mandate was originally announced, CTA expected that upwards of 20% of the 120,000 Canadian truck drivers crossing the US-Canada border would have likely remained unvaccinated by January 2022. Of the 40,000 US-based truck drivers crossing the border, CTA estimated that upwards of 40% of these drivers would not be prepared to meet the vaccine mandate requirement. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay, and just one last question about this. You would agree that the reduction of truck drivers crossing the border when there are already supply chain issues could have an effect on the economy?
I don't agree with the estimates that are provided there. And
Okay.
I don't agree with the assertion that the vaccine mandates themselves caused problems for our supply chain.
But they affected it. They had a contribution to that supply chain problem.
No, I don't agree with that.
Okay, well, let's
the
scroll
vast
down.
majority of Canadian truckers are in fact and were at the time vaccinated and supported the vaccine mandates.
Okay, well, let's go to page 6, please. Okay, in the first paragraph that we see there, the CTA is giving stats that truckers move about 70% of the $648 billion Canada-US trade. Does that sound about right to you?
Again, I can't
You have no
say
reason
whether
to disagree with
that's
it, though.
true or not, but I have no reason to. Let me say this. Trucking is very important for the Canadian economy. Trucking is very important for our supply chains, and trucking is very important for cross-border trade. That I am very prepared to agree with.
I think we can all agree on that. And let's just consider that if what the Canadian, if what the CTA is saying is correct, and the drivers are reduced by 20%, that's a reduction of 24,000 trucks in the supply chain.
The challenge here for me is I disagree with the fundamental premise. And this was something that was looked at carefully by Minister Alghabra and also by the Minister of Health.
Okay, so you disagree with the fundamental premise of the Canadian Trucker Alliance. Thank you. I'll move on to something else. I just want to understand a little bit more about what was going on in January. And you gave some evidence today, and I think you told us that it was a very intense month for you. That would be fair?
Yes, that would be fair.
Okay, and let me make sure that I understand it. So on the one hand, you were preparing a budget.
Yes.
Okay, and there was the issue of the Build Back Better legislation in the States, and there was the electric vehicle tax credit, right? That was on your plate.
Not solely on mine, but it was something I was working on.
Right. And there was the COVID recovery, and there were local and global supply chain issues.
Yes.
Okay, and there was the looming threat of inflation.
Yes.
And we talked a little bit about the Ukraine, and I think you said that was the biggest threat to national security since World War II.
The Russian invasion.
The Russian invasion.
When it actually happened, yes, I think that is the biggest national security challenge our country has faced.
And it was on your radar in January.
Yes, it was.
Okay, and in the midst of this, there was this trucker protest of unprecedented proportions taking place across the country, and you described that as whack-a-mole.
No, what I would describe as what we saw happening from the moment that the initial occupation began is copycat protests happening across the country, and that posed a particular national challenge.
I see. I thought you said the word whack-a-mole, but it's not important. But what is important, I would put to you, is that the US was unhappy with the situation in Canada, and they were seeing their own vulnerability in our supply chains. That was your evidence, was it not?
Certainly.
And they didn't like that.
The, in particular, blockade of the Ambassador Bridge exposed the vulnerability of the US economy, particularly the car sector, to the Canadian car sector.
Exactly. And I put it to you, Minister, that the government felt that they had to do something about these protests, not because of threats of serious violence, but because your government was completely overwhelmed and you were under a tremendous amount of pressure from the United States.
I absolutely disagree with that.
Okay, well, we heard evidence from you earlier today, and you said that you were put into contact with Brian Dees. So he's the economic advisor to the president. He's a very influential player in the decision for the electric vehicle tax credit issue, and he actually contacted you.
That's correct.
Right? And you thought that it was striking that someone of his importance, who's so hard to get a hold of, contacted you.
I had spoken to Brian Dees before and since, but the speed and urgency with which he got in touch with me was definitely significant and relevant.
And he was unhappy, and there could be major economic consequences.
What he said to me, as I reported in that readout, was that they were very concerned that because of the blockades, US factories would shut down.
Right, and we heard that the CEOs of two major banks contacted you, Canadian banks, I believe. And we also heard that President Biden, who's probably the world's most powerful person, or near that, had a telephone call with the Prime Minister.
Yes, both of those things are true.
And that telephone call, it happened on a Friday, and by the Monday, the Emergencies Act was invoked.
That's true.
Okay, and so I put it to you, Minister, that the federal government had to show the USA that they were in control, and that explains why the Emergencies Act was invoked, despite the fact that, for example, the Ambassador Bridge was cleared and open to traffic.
No, I wouldn't agree with that characterization.
Okay, well, I would put it to you that the pressure the government was under explains why the Emergencies Act was invoked, despite the fact that a deal had been struck with the protesters in Ottawa to reduce the footprint of the protest in that city.
Again, I would disagree with that.
Well, let's see if you would agree with this. I'd put it to you that there was no meaningful consultation with the provinces, not even advance notice of what the First Minister's meeting was about, and that's because the government didn't have time for it. They just had to make a decision about the Emergencies Act because of the tremendous pressure that they were under.
Again, I disagree with a great deal of that characterization.
One last question for you then, Ms. Freeland. I put it to you that given the overwhelming situation that the government was facing explains why they were willing to use extraordinary powers against their own people, despite the fact that no police agency or intelligence agency told them that there were threats to the security of Canada.
Again, I disagree with many of the premises in that question, and I would be happy to elaborate, but it seems that we're out of time.
Seems so. Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.